Jordan McNair would have turned 20 years old yesterday. McNair is the University of Maryland sophomore lineman who died 2 weeks after collapsing at football practice last summer. It was a preventable death the school finally acknowledged. The most courage anyone showed during the whole odyssey came from Ellis McKinney, McNair's closest friend on the team. After the Maryland Board of Regents originally didn't hold anyone accountable, he tweeted, "Every Saturday, my teammates and I have to kneel before the memorial of our fallen teammate. It's never the wrong time to do what's right." Let me repeat that. It's never the wrong time to do what's right. Hours after that tweet, the coach responsible for that program was permanently fired. Now, as a direct result of what happened, a bill in the Maryland State House has been introduced that would give college athletes the right to unionize. Some of the early language drafted by sponsors reads like this: the State Higher Education Labor Relations Board would be required to adopt regulations authorizing and establishing the process for collective bargaining for student athletes on or before July 1st, 2020. Imagine that, giving student athletes, many of whom play Division I college football and basketball and raise much more money for their institutions than any paid university employee, actual rights and say in their time as indentured servants for their schools. More importantly, maybe protect a player from a program that had no business operating the way it did. It's unclear whether Maryland elected officials will connect the dots and realize the importance of such a bill. Already it's being talked about as a long shot. But it'd be another courageous way of memorializing a Maryland football player who needlessly died. Jordan McNair, a friend, a son, a kid just trying to get an education with a football scholarship. I'm Mike Weiss.